Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Adventures, and today we're doing part 82 of our Jurassic World Evolution 2 mod spotlights, where we take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and compare them to their real life fossil counterparts. So today, I think we've got a really cool assortment of animals. We've got a couple dinosaurs, we got a marine reptile, but we've also got a lot of animals from the Pleistocene. So we had Pleistocene pack with the dude, and we've got another really cool Pleistocene animal that we're going to have a look at. So this one's going to be a little bit more themed than normal, but it's quite cool. We're going to have a look at first. We're going to go to our marine reptile first. We've got by Rauisuchus, we've got Dolichorhynchops. So we are, here's Dolichorhynchops. Let's have a look at you. You look so pretty in that position there. Anyway, so Dolichorhynchops. These guys are an extinct genus of polycotyledonid plesiosaur from the late Cretaceous, about the Campanian, I believe, of North America. And they consist of two species, Osborni and Herachelys, and other two species that have been described in new genera I'll get into. So they've been found in the late Coanian and early Campanian rocks. So that's the first species, Osborni, and then Herachelys has been found in late Campanian to early Maastrichtian rocks. So Osborni is older, technically. So the holotype was found in the Upper Smoke Hill Chalk, Logan County in Kansas, by George F. Sternberg, who was about a teenager at the time. And the remains were collected by him by his father, Charles H. Sternberg, and sold to the University of Kansas, and then prepared by Dr. Samuel Weddell Winston, and has been on display at the Kansas University of Natural KU Museum of Natural History since then, and has an estimated holotype head size of about 57 centimeters, or about 1.8 feet long. Dolichorhynchops itself got to about 3 meters, or about just under 10 feet long, and its generic name means long-nosed face. So they found a second less complete specimen of that Osborni in 1926 and tried to spell it to the museum and took pictures in the photograph. Then it was on display another place. And then another one, the specimen on exhibit, was also was exhibit in Sternberg, which was found by Marion Boner near Russell Springs in Logan County, around there, the same place. Was a total body length of just about 10 feet. And then was originally kind of described as Osborni, a Triomyrcum, and then lumped into Dolichorhynchops. Well, then it was now it's described as Triomyrcum Osborni, so it's a different species, or different genera. And the other species is found from the Bear Paw, Saskatchewan, Canada, from late Campanian to Maastrichtian. It was found near the town of Herschel in southwestern Saskatchewan, so that's where it kind of got the name from. And the formation was found and had lots of mudstone and sandstones that were laid down when the western interior stairway was just beginning to dry up. The type specimen itself was found articulated, but it is relatively complete. Only all forelimbs were missing though, and the other things like that, but it was generally pretty good. And also is believed to be an adult, so it would have been adult specimens of what was Osborni, the older ones, so they got smaller over time. Herachelys actually got smaller, so it was just about 8.2 to 9 feet long, so not huge. But as I mentioned, there were two other species. Triomyrcum boneri is now considered its own species, was probably considered a member of Dolichorhynchops. And then Martichelys was also kind of considered one as well. In terms of classification, though, they are in a group called the polycotylids. So this was a group of plesiosaurs, like the long-necked plesiosaurs, not the pliosaurs, that kind of independently evolved that short head. So it's kind of like a plesiosaur mimicking a pliosaur. So it's quite interesting. And its close relatives, as I mentioned, is like Trichomerum and Paulosaurus. And Serpentinosaurus is considered more basal, which has got the big head and the long neck. A very interesting animal, but yeah, great one by Rauisuchus. Really great mod. Do love them, how can you not? But yeah, now we're going to move on. So we've got another really cool animal. We've got a sauropod here. We've got Supersaurus by Rauisuchus. Yeah, let's have a look. Here is Supersaurus. So Supersaurus, which means super lizard, kind of obvious, but sometimes you don't want to take that initiative, is these guys are a genus of diplodocid sauropod that lived in North America during the late Jurassic, and the type species is Supersaurus vivinidae, was first discovered by Vivian Jones in Delta, Colorado, from the Middle Morrison Formation of Colorado in 1972, and the fossil remains came from the Bushy Basin member dating to about 153 to 145 million years ago. It is among the longest dinosaurs discovered, or definitely among them, or like one of the biggest, or longest, with specimens reaching between 33 to 40 meters, or about 108 to 131 feet in length, with the largest individual potentially being exceeding 130 feet or 40 meters. And mass estimates kind of go between like 39 to 49 tons, or 35 to 44 tons. And there's a second species, which is Dinosaurus, or is also sometimes called Supersaurus laharensis, is known for Portugal and lives about a similar time. As I mentioned, found around Deinotherium, kind of mentioned that story. The first find of it actually only really yielded a few bones, like a scapular coracoid, which is part of the shoulder girdle, and that was already a big bone. It was about 2.4 meters, or about 7 feet long. And it was kind of officially named Supersaurus about that time, but was not described until 1985. And it was thought that this was originally going to be a large species of Barosaurus, but there has been later found evidence that these guys may have been their own genus. A much more complete specimen was found in 1986, though, and was named Jimbo, found by Fryer and Bart Lesko, and was purchased from the land and described in 2007, and it has about 30% of the specimen complete, and its bones are held at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center, and a comparison with other specimens previously assigned to the species were done ordered up the side from the dry Mercer quarry belonging to the species to see how it goes. And the species does have a little bit of a complex taxonomical history. So it's also known as Ultrasaurus. So he originally described it simultaneously described another species of big sauropod called Ultrasaurus machalushi. It was known from a backbone, and then later found that backbone actually came from Supersaurus. So because Supersaurus was named first, Ultrasaurus was named, and then kind of named, but then Supersaurus kind of took over. So it's kind of the junior synonym now. It's now considered abandoned. Don't use it anymore. Other bones, though, have been found in the same location that actually belonged to Brachiosaurus. It was kind of like a really interesting one. But these Brachiosaurus bones actually suggest this may be a large Brachiosaurus, which is quite cool. Originally, Supersaurus and Brachiosaurus bones were thought to be from a single dinosaur that was Ultrasaurus, that was supposed to be like 30 meters long, 8 meters tall, and about 50 meters total height, like a giant, like sort of Poseidon type. And it was actually found to be a chimera. So that's quite interesting. And there's other species that have been lumped to it, like Dinosaurus has been lumped into it, now considered a specimen. But as I mentioned, these guys are quite notable for being among the largest dinosaurs in existence, and probably one of the good ones with a few ones with really good remains. With specimens reaching potentially up to 40 meters in length. There was actually a study on Jimbo that suggests that when he died, it was believed to be 225 years old, but it's considered a lot extremely unlikely just because of the growth rings. But they believe animals would have been... the same study found that it was a 33-meter specimen Diplodocus that was about 60 years old, which would make it one of the oldest dinosaurs known. And the age of even Jimbo could be even greater, could be because of remodeling. So it's really hard to get a good age for sauropods since they just grow so fast. And that's quite cool. The first described specimens, as I mentioned, large diplodocid, large vertebrae, which is considered to be Barosaurus. So that's where the big 50 meter long Barosaurus came from. But then it was reassigned to Supersaurus. It's not 100% near here nor there, but that's kind of where it came from. And in terms of its relationships, it's in the group Diplodocines, so it is related to Diplodocus animals like Diplodocus, Barosaurus, Teneria from Teneguru. So, and as I mentioned, there's also the sister species to Dinosaurs, which is also often grouped with Supersaurus, or sometimes considered the same species. But yeah, in terms of its body plan, not really too much different from the typical sauropod, body design, especially Diplodocid, really long tail, long neck. Really, really cool animal. Really love how this came out, and it's got the correct feet. How can you not love it when it's got the correct feet? So pretty awesome. So let you run off and do your thing. Okay, so let you run off. Next up, we've got by trip, we've got Rauisuchus. So this is a Rauisuchus, a very cool guy. So Rauisuchus, or Wilhelm Rau's crocodile, is a genus of extinct archosaur that comes from Geopark in Pelarata, Brazil, from the late Jurassic. And the single species is Rauisuchus tronanidens. So, in terms of its kind of description, it was found near Santa Maria in San Jose. Dr. Wilhelm Rau, who's a fossil collector working under Frederick von Huenen, actually discovered the remains of this Rauisuchus crocodile, and he made it about 20 to 30 meters away from the site road known as Zangasha, which was likely a ravine or encampment escarpment next to the road. And they found it within the kind of the utmost 2.5 meters of an 8-meter layer. And it was then brought to Germany along with a holotype of Prestosuchus, so it's one of those animals described with them. This is back in 1928 or 29. Then they described it and considered an open dubium, and then they described the tarsus as a lectotype to bring back the genus, and it seems they actually had quite a bit of it as well, some vertebrae, tibia, fibia, osteoderms, things like that. And the specimen found by Rau was actually re-described by Lancaster and Rauisuchus in 2014, and found more stuff and considered it more diagnostic, so it's kind of considered to maybe Rauisuchus. Could not really be defined, but several isolated teeth it could be, so it's kind of, one of those animals that's neither here nor there. But still a really cool animal. It probably got up to about 4 meters in length, about 13 feet long, and would have been 19 centimeters, of just under a meter tall, or about 35 inches at the hip, and weighed about 250 kilograms, or 550 pounds. Rauisuchus was distinguished from other members of Rauisuchidae as it had very on the basis of its very knob-like thickening of the base of its posterior on the premaxilla. So that's kind of like around here. The premaxilla is here, and some really interesting cervicals and some other smaller, things that define it from other animals. And it belonged to a group of large relatives of crocodilians that were land-dwelling. So if you know Postosuchus, animals like that, or Prestosuchus, they are Rauisuchians. Although it was actually originally described as a Therodontia at that time. But these guys were kind of the top species or top predators of their time. Basically T-Rex before T-Rex. They would have been large animals eating other reptiles and even potentially early dinosaurs. And it was found to be a sister taxon of animals such as Techeosuchus and Yarasuchus. So a group of, South American Rauisuchians. So quite cool. Definitely a cool little guy. So we can let you run off and do your thing. Very, very cute. So next up, we've got the Pleistocene pack done by Master Dude. It's the next 4 animals will be part of that pack. So we're going to have a look at first, Mekosuchus. So Mekosuchus is a genus. It's not just a singular species in the genus. There's about 4 different species. So they're in a group of extinct Australasian or Australian Mesosuchine crocodiles, and species of Mesosuchus are generally described as being quite small, less than 2 meters, terrestrial animals with short, blunt faces and strong limbs, and there's 4 different species described, which we'll get into. So the genus itself was considered quite widespread, with the earliest members being found in the Oligocene and Miocene of Australia, and coexisted with other Mesosuchines, which is the larger group of crocodilians that it belonged to, with the high crocodile diversity, with some being, terrestrial hunters, some being ambush predators, and some being fish eaters. And the anatomy of vertebrae of one species, of White hunterensis, actually might indicate that it may be well adapted for stripping flesh from carcasses, using side-to-side threshing and its blade-like teeth. The younger 2 species, as we'll get into, is found from the Pacific islands of New Caledonia and Vanuatu. respectively, actually making them some of the youngest Mekosuchus kinds, or youngest Mekosuchines. So Mekosuchus itself, these two species, died out probably about 3,000 years ago in the middle of the Holocene, but some authors that they may have lived until even more recently. But unlike mainland species, M. expecticus actually had quite bulbous posterior teeth, which it may have used for crushing mollusks and crustaceans. And some research suggests they may have been primarily nocturnal, but what caused their extinction is unclear, as we'll get into. So the first kind of specimens were found in New Caledonia, where the first bone was a fragmentary quadrijugal found in 1981, and in subsequent years have found around the place there was a lot more evidence and like skull fragments and things like that. And such fossils were first reported by Eric Bufftat in 1983, and probably described by Hin and Jean Christel Ballot in 1987. And due to the strange anatomy of this material, it was actually considered to be an early Eusuchian, so which was at the time considered a suborder of a crocodilian, and now it's placed in its own family, the Mekosuchidae. And then 10 years later, 1997, another species was described from the River Schley World Heritage Site in Queensland, which was White Hunterensis. That was not only geographically saturated by time, like not separated because it's Australia, that's in New Caledonia. This one was from the late Oligocene, and that one was from, the Pleistocene, mid-Miocene. So it makes the first incident was found in Australia, on the mainland instead of the island, and then there's been a couple other species described. There was one Kalaposki that was named in 2002 from Vanuatu, and then other additional remains of M. whiteorensis and things were found at that time. So the first species I mentioned, in Expecticus, that was the first one found. It's from the Holocene of New Caledonia. That's probably the one that one of the ones that this one represents. So these guys would have lived about, 3,000, probably went extinct about 4,000, 3,000 years ago, potentially even a little bit earlier, a couple thousand years ago, a little bit later, I mean. And there's some authors suggest that they may be Pleistocene rather than Holocene. And the name Inexpecticus means because they didn't know where they found them from. The other species from Vanuatu is kind of also being young as well. It's kind of disputed. And the remains are much more fragmentary. There's only a couple bits. And the poor preservation, the same area, is kind of interesting. So they're kind of considered the poor preservation in the two species. They could be the same. They could be the same, but maybe not. The species is actually named after the Prime Minister, who was Donald Kalapowski, when it was discovered, who had noted a strong support for archaeological excavations that yield the fossils of this crocodilian. In Sandarai was also a really cool one. That's the one from the early Miocene from Queensland. So this one's a little bit older, and then White Hunterensis is the oldest known species, also comes from River Schley in early Miocene, so it's a little bit older. So there's a little bit of there's White Hunterensis, the oldest, then Sandarai, and then Kalapowski and Inexpecticus, which could be the same, kind of in the middle there. So in terms of their description, they are called brachiocephalic, which means they have short skulls, and they look quite different from your normal crocodilian. They're much more well adapted for land. Only distinctly relevant genus like Osteololamus, which includes, they would have been compared to that regard because they would have been a lot more on the ground, instead of in the water. And even some have been compared to Notosuchians from the Mesozoic, which is quite cool. So we have a pretty good idea of what they're like. The best known species is Inexpecticus, which has very interesting basal but also, characteristic traits. I'm not going to get too much into them, but some that look like more basal crocodiles like Alberta champsa and Rauisuchus, which are like Cretaceous, but some look like more alligatoroids and things like that. So it's a very interesting hodgepodge of different adaptations. And these guys would have had a distinct wave-like matter in their throat and in their tooth row that is usually less pronounced. So these guys would have been quite good, getting meat and things as well. And there is some differences between the different species that shows they probably each had different sort of ecologies, which is quite cool. And even some have been humorous as quite similar to monitor lizards, so they would have been walking around more similar to monitor lizards. And in terms of dentition, the 4 different species, there's some difference within the teeth. So M. expecticus has 13 teeth, while M. whitehunterensis has 16. M. carparensis has and M. sandarai both have 12, and the latter 13, so 12 and 13, so pretty much about the same. However, in shape, they're a lot more noticeable. So White Hunterensis has more smooth, Sandarai laterally compressed, and some Albumus, as I mentioned, Expecticus, are more bulbous, probably well adapted for eating, shellfish and mollusks. In some ways, are like more generally, there's two states. There's some more similar to alligators, especially in their overbite, and some that are more like crocodilians, where they have both up and down teeth going on. And in terms of their size, Mekosuchus is actually one of the smallest species of Mesosuchines. They only got to like 2 meters long, and some even like 1 meter. So this is much smaller than a lot of other crocodilians today. In terms of phylogeny, it is the group Mekosuchidae, which is a whole group, whole family of land-dwelling crocodilians that include animals like Megalania from Australia, Baru, Canberra, Australopithecus through animals that kind of fit in that, and then was kind of moved into being more basal, into very much, Mesosuchines within Crocodilia, so they are considered sister to crocodiles. And then you have Quickalanias there as well. In terms of paleogeography, as I mentioned, they've been found a couple species, some of the older ones found in Australia, but New Caledonia and Vanuatu both have Inexpecticus and Sanderi, which, as I mentioned before, could be the same thing. This could have been a thing because of genetic drift, continental drift, and they believe it's not sure whether they were cold tolerant or salt tolerant, like modern crocodilians, but they could have drifted on land masses to live there, which is quite interesting. And there's a lot of overlap with there's some overlap with the fauna of Vanuatu and New Caledonia, so they could have just like migrated there naturally. And there was actually a Mesosuchine from New Zealand. We don't know much about it, but yeah, that's one thing. So it could have been more ancestral. These guys, like some of their closest relatives, are believed to be terrestrial, as they had flattened skulls. They weren't really that well adapted for aquatic life. They would have very much been like modern monitor lizards, potentially. And they would have been, much more land animals like predators. In some neck adaptations, I mentioned they would have been able to like death roll like normal crocodilians, but they would have been able to eat side to side and eat very similar to modern crocodilians. Mainland species are known from localities where they may have coexisted with multiple other species, so the other island species were kind of doing their own thing. Though, and as I mentioned before, Inexpecticus, the later species, had more rounded teeth, which was more well adapted for eating harder foods like crustaceans and mollusks, similar to like more modern dwarf crocodilians or dwarf caiman. In terms of extinction, the extinction of Megasuchines has historically been linked to the arrival of human settlers, and there's some support of this as kind of the direct association. The range of Mekosuchus kind of overlaps with human settlement, and they think this may have been because of invasive species, but also people hunting them. They could have gone there, but there is some dispute there. There's not really evidence of humans actually contributing to their extinction, but it does make kind of a lot of sense because it's a pattern that's happened all over the world. But yeah, still quite cool. Definitely a big fan. So we're going to let you run off and do your thing, little guy. Okay, let's let you run off. So next up we have got Dionis. So this is one from New Zealand. So this is Dionis. So this is Dionis, or the giant moa. So there's two different species of giant moa. I'll get into that. So the giant moa, these guys are an extinct genus of bird belonging to the moa family. And like other moa, they are in the order Deinotherium, which was only found in New Zealand. And there's two different species considered, the North Island giant moa and the South Island giant moa, or Deinonychus novazelandiae and Dionis robustus in Kusine. So this was South Island, one is robustus. Nova Zelandia is the North Island. And there has been two further lineages suggested by DNA, but we'll get into that. So these guys were considered pretty much the tallest bird to ever live, with the females being the largest, so females could be up to 3 times the size of the males. So they could stand to about 3.6 meters, or about 12 feet tall, and ones at the most massive could be between about 230 to 278 kilograms, or between 500 and 613 pounds. So very, very big animals. With also Nova Zelandia being potentially slightly smaller than robustus because of being more south. They needed to be bigger to better contain body heat. So feathers, we do have preserved feathers from these guys. We believe that they had feathers that were like a reddish brown, that were hair-like, almost like kiwi feathers, and covered most of the body except for most of the head and the lower body. And while no feathers have been found from moa chicks, it's likely they would have been speckled or striped to camouflage themselves from the Haas eagle. And one thing about this as well, what's really cool, is that we do have little holes in their skull that suggest they would have had a crest. It's very common in the crested moa, but there's other species, as I mentioned, like Dionis and the little bush moa do have them too. So it's cool that that was represented in this fossil reconstruction as well. One thing as well, it shouldn't have its head like this. It should. They spent most of their time with the head kind of straight. Rather than their head up like that. They could have done that for like, alert position, but more neutral, they would have had their head out straight. And this little area here, they didn't really have a tail. I think this just needs to be a little bit more feathered. Get rid of that little tail. It doesn't really need that tail. But yeah, the feet were quite large and powerful, and they could just deliver quite strong kicks if they are threatened. And the bird has a long, strong necks and broad, sharp beaks, which would allow them to eat vegetation from herbs and through tree branches. And they had a relatively short, small head with a pointed or somewhat flattened or somewhat curved beak. Depending on the species, M. robustus kind of had a more curved beak, and Novazelandiae was much more curved. Robustus was a little more straight. There's a little bit of difference. It's not a huge difference between them. But yeah, these guys were named Deinotheriformes in the family Deinotheridae, more closely related to things like the upland moa or Megalopithecus than things like Pachyornis and Australopithecus and the other species. But in terms of their habitat, they were very adaptable. They did live pretty much in all of the South Island. Giant moa lived pretty much all around the South Island, and same for the North Island, so they would have lived pretty much in all sorts of habitats. And there is some sexual dimorphism. It was actually originally described, other species like the slender moa and the other species kind of considered to be actually different species, but were actually males. So the smaller ones are actually the males of the larger species, so it's all been lumped, which is quite interesting. And in terms of reproduction, whilst it's possible to know exactly how they reproduced, we do have a good idea of things like some things like as well. Being larger, the females would have been more territorial, and they would have fought for the males. And eggs may have been laid in communal nests in sand dunes, or by individuals sheltering in hollow trees or rocks. And the eggs would have had little to do. The females would have little to do with the eggs, and then the male would have incubated them for about 3 months. Dionis eggs were enormous, about as large as a rugby ball, or about 80 times the size of a volume of a chicken egg. However, despite their size, they had very thin shells, with eggshells being just over 1 millimeter thick, and robustus being just about 1.4 millimeters thick. So they might consider the most fragile of all eggs to date. And it's possible this could have led to the males being so much smaller than the females. So the males, because they were sitting on the eggs and protecting their eggs, being much smaller, would have reduced the chance of them crushing or hurting them. So that's very interesting. And in terms of extinction, they seem to have been pretty good in New Zealand up until when the Polynesian came, which hunted them for food. All taxa, pretty much all giant moa and all boa went extinct around the 1500s, about 700 years ago. And it's generally accepted that Maori, the Maori, kind of took over and kind of killed them all. However, some birds became extinct due to farming. So later species, since like the huia, chopped down, caught. But this was like some of the first species to go, just because they're the big species and people eat them. And yeah, that's how they became extinct. But yeah, still really, really cool. I do love this nice mod. Really, really awesome. So we'll let them run off and do their thing. So next up, we've got, moving over to Australia, we have got Megalania. So here's the big guys themselves. Let's have a little looky-loo. Who should we pick? We'll pick you. So this is Megalania. So Megalania ovaranus priscus is an extinct species of giant monitor lizard and is part of the megafaunal assemblage of Pleistocene Australia. It is the largest known terrestrial lizard known to have existed, though its fragmentary remains, we don't know exactly how big it could have got, but about 3 meters long, excluding its tail, is kind of recent specimens. That's a recent studies. So that snout to vent, so that's quite big. That's basically the size of a Komodo dragon, including the tail, with some individual sorts have been quite a bit bigger. So in terms of its taxonomy, it was first known by remains in 1859 that were collected by Sir Richard Owen, who collected them also with a lot of, marsupials. And its name, Megalania priscus, means ancient great roamer, which is in reference to the terrestrial nature of this great saurian. And then over the time, it was kind of used to be like butcher, and ancient giant butcher was kind of the misinterpretation. But Megalania is no longer considered a valid genus, and is considered a junior synonym of Varanus, which encompasses all living monitor lizards, and which is quite interesting. And they have been included in studies with other varanids, because its morphology suggests it's more closely related to some species of Varanus than others. So excluding Varanus, excluding Megalania from these researchers would make Varanus paraphyletic, so it needed to be lumped in there. So now it's considered Varanus priscus. And its Varanus would have been the current subgenus along with its monitors, and unless other Asian monitors are shown to be exclusive in this genus Megalania, it won't be a common name. So several studies have been looking into its relatedness to other species. Its affinity to parentes was based on kind of its skull roof morphology, but the most recent comprehensive study on other things have suggested that its closest living relative is the Komodo dragon, and its closest Australian relative is the lace monitor, so those kind of animals, Varanus and Komodoensis. And so that shows what it's related to. As I mentioned, the size, this is lack of complete or nearly complete fossils is really hard to determine. Early estimates put them up to 7 meters long and about 600 to 620 kilograms, and then there have been downsides since. The most recent studies have kind of suggested that they could reach about 5 meters or 4 or 5 meters. So they also noted the possible that they could have gotten about 9 meters long, and there could have been, some. So a lot of these estimates are kind of up in the air, but potentially up to the biggest estimates was about like 7 meters or like 2.4 meters. The largest vertebrae suggests there's one could have been about 3.8 meters, 12 feet long, and weighed just under 2 tons. So yeah, it just kind of depends on who you ask, but there's a lot of estimates. In terms of its paleobiology, though, it was the largest terrestrial lizard known to exist, and would have mostly fed on large marsupials, things like the protodon and other larger marsupials, along with other reptiles and small mammals, also birds and eggs. So Modus is not very picky, so he would have just been on that seafood diet. Seafood, you eat it. And there has been some regard to skepticism that Megalania was actually the only principal predator of Pleistocene megafauna. There's also Thylacoleo, or the marsupial lion, that they probably would have competed with. Also Quicklania, which was a terrestrial crocodile that grew quite big. They would have all been kind of competing for that larger apex predator niche in the ecosystem. As also mentioned, Komodo dragons are the Megalania's closest relative, and they would have been known to evolve in Australia before spreading into Indonesia. And if one to reconstruct the ecosystem, reintroducing Komodo dragons would be it's kind of a good proxy, they say, for Megalania, but it's not necessarily. They probably had very different ecologies. But yeah, they would be kind of rewilding because Komodo dragons did used to live in Australia. And a study published in 2009 suggested, looking at the speed limit of these guys, would have been about 2.6 to 3 meters a second, or about 9 to 10 kilometers an hour, which is comparable to an extant freshwater crocodile. And the scales of Megalania would have been quite similar to those of relatives, having a honeycomb microstructure that was both durable but also resistant to water evaporation. So venom, along with other varanid lizards, such as the Komodo dragon and the Nile monitor, Megalania belong in the group Toxicophora, which are reptile clades that are all known to have toxic glands. That even includes things like bearded dragons and iguanids and things like that. So these guys and closely related varanids used a potent venom that had a hemotoxin, which would act as an anticoagulant, so it would have made you bleed more and more to increase the bleeding. So they would have died from their wounds, and then they would have died from shock, and they would have this would have made them likely the largest venomous animal known. And in terms of its extinction, the youngest specimens date from the late Pleistocene, which includes a large osteoderm about 50,000 years in age from Montana Caves National Park in central eastern Queensland. And the study estimated a morphology of 9 closely related extant verandid lizards that allometry scaled to kind of scaled to briskers, and found in a muscular that would have been likely inefficient when attempting to outrun human settlers, so they would have got tired too quick. And considering the other species of these megafauna went extinct at the same time, it's likely that could have all happened. But there is confrontations between, it was believed that confrontations between Megalania and ancient Aborigines or First Nations people would have inspired stories of, the hui and things like that. But yeah, these guys would have likely had to deal with them, and either directly, indirectly, either humans or climate change. There is evidence of aridification, destroying a lot of, making Australia more dry, worse habitat for a lot of these animals. So yeah, it's Pleistocene extinction is always something that's a little bit in debate and controversial. But yeah, we're finished here. So that's Megalania, on our second to last animal, and the last animal for the Pleistocene pack. We've got everyone's favourite mammal. We've got Deinotherium. So let's have a look at this guy. So this is good old Deinotherium. So let's have a look. So let's have a look. We'll have a look at this one since he's standing out on his own a little bit. So this is Deinotherium. So these guys are considered an extinct genus of large elephant-like proboscidean that lived in the Middle Miocene right up until the early Pleistocene. So even though it kind of looks reminiscent of a modern elephant, they had a much more flexible neck and limbs much more adapted for being cursorial or walking around, as well as tusks, as you can see, kind of that curve downwards from the mandible instead of the tusks that grow from the canines like modern elephants. Deinotherium itself was a quite wide-ranging genus found from East Africa into southern Europe and east into India. And they were primarily browsers, feeding on leaves, and they likely went extinct due to environmental changes, such as forests being replaced by grasslands during the later half of the Neogene, and they would have thrived the longest in Africa, becoming extinct in the early Pleistocene. So Deinotherium does have a long history, so it was first described back in the 17th century, and was found in the bones of the animals of the Field of Giants later on, and then these bones would have been exhibited in France, Germany, and in 1775 they actually looked at these bones and suggested they were similar to a mammoth. And during the late 18th, 19th century, George Cuvier actually suggested that this was a large tapir with upward curving tucks and named it Tapir giantesque. Another early hypothesis suggests that it was a sirenian or related to dugongs and manatees, using its teeth as an anchor while it was sleeping, which is not true at all. But the genus itself was described in 1829 by Johann Carl von Kamp, who from a fossil in skull and mandible in Germany, and the fossil D. giganteum was thought to be the evolutionary link between sloths and mastodons. But further evidence suggests that, they would have come apart in Pro-Deinotherium, and they actually found quite solidly. It was found within Proboscidea, and there are some finds of described as Edicum range the genus outside of Europe. And some exceptionally large specimens have been described as Giganteum, and there has been a few other species described over in time, but Deinotherium kind of means terrible beast. That's what its name means in Latin. So these guys were quite a large-bodied Proboscidean, displaying continued growth between species, with two adult males of D. giganteum being found to be about 3.6 to 4 meters tall, or about 11 to 13 feet, and weigh about 8.8 to 12 tons, or about 8.7 to 11.8 tons, which was similar adults in size of Brovicum, so there's kind of differences between there. A few different specimens, they all kind of reach that 4 meter tall range, and the most recent specimens about 9 tons, so about 9 to 13 tons is kind of the general one. And they're quite similar to modern elephants, though they have longer, more slender limbs. They've also got, as I mentioned, less robust, and they have relatively longer legs. They made a little bit more browser like a giraffe. And the largest skulls of these guys could got about 120, 130 centimeters, or about 47 to 51 inches. And they had large openings that suggest a trunk, but we don't know the extent and length of this trunk. They would have been enough to allow them to actually bend down and drink, of course. And they had a lower cranium, so much longer face than a normal elephant or a typical elephant. And the tusks are the very interesting thing. So these guys actually grow them from the lower incisors, and while modern elephants have them from upper canines. So this is kind of like a little bit different for them. So the curvature itself is really interesting, and it kind of goes backwards. And as I mentioned before, although the presence of this is quite likely, it's quite evident due to the shape of the skull anatomy. It's been long debated. So there's some initial estimates that kind of had a really weird soft tissue reconstructions, but most likely they would have had a trunk, but not quite as long as a modern elephant, maybe something tapir-like or something a little bit longer. And we're kind of curious, because of its posture, quite long-limbed, but how long that trunk would be and things like that. So it's kind of, how would we interpret it? There are a few different species. There's been 31 species described, many from like poor material, but they're kind of all been lumped into 3 now. So there's Borzai, which was the last known specimen, came from Kenya, lived to about the Pleistocene, and other species I mentioned lumped into it. And this is a species that's kind of a little bit smaller than those of European species, so this would have been animals of lower latitudes are typically smaller than the relatives at higher latitudes. However, these guys may have actually been subject to acidification, so maybe smaller to better adapt to those changes. Also, Gigantium is from Europe, so lived from the Middle Miocene to Early Pliocene. However, the exact extinction is unknown. There's been material found in Russia as well, and potentially on Crete of these guys, due to the time that was on mainland. There were no dwarf Deinotheriums yet. In terms of Indicum, so Indicum is described by being a little bit more, as we found in India, Middle Late Miocene as well, but more robust dentition, and disappeared from the record about 7 million years ago. Although it's generally regarded as valid, some argue it to be lumped into Procavin, as I mentioned before, which is another species. But yeah, it's kind of like debated neither here nor there. There's like this and Procavin, and that it can sometimes consider junior synonyms, so it's kind of, taxonomy being taxonomy. There's also Deinotherium, which is a distinct genus that's a lot smaller than these ones, but we really don't know. As we mentioned, quite widespread, found from East Africa, Europe, Arabia, into Southeast and East Asia, so they lived quite a wide range in different few species, and they've been found in a lot of those areas. The origin of these guys, they were first found in the Oligocene of Africa with the relatively small JWE2, initially kind of restricted to Africa. They moved across into Europe and Asia and Eurasia in the Proboscidean down-tomb event, along with the ancestral Dinotherium that would become the Deinotherium itself. Generally, they display relatively little change in their morphology, just more of increase in size from Dinotherium to Dinotherium, getting to about the same size as modern African elephants. And the reason for this increase is kind of interpreted to be multiple factors, better predator deterrent, especially with the hyenodonts and large cats around, better able to browse, Bergman's rule because they're moving into cooler climates, things like that. But yeah, they are considered sister to Elephantiformes, so they're not that close. They're in Proboscidea, but just out of more closely related elephants. They're not related to at all to like Gomphotheres and mammoths and things like that. But some very interesting adaptations. Seem to be a browsing animal, very well adapting for browse. So they would have potentially lived in woodlands, and kind of eating a lot of more tropical and subtropical plants, because they had a slightly more raised heel posture, and their teeth are more like modern tapirs, which are animals that feed more on fruits and leaves and things like that, so much more browser than the grazer. And they would have moved across open landscapes as well, and probably been responsible, as well, and that's probably why they went extinct, with more open landscapes becoming a thing. There was less trees for them to browse on, and that could have led them extinct. And there have been some evidence of them potentially travelling in herds and things like that. But there is evidence of them range shifting because of climate change, but they don't seem to be permanent residents of most places. And one of the weird features of these is their tusks, and research concluded that suggests their tusks were not used for digging or being sexually dimorphic, which was leaving the use of feeding as the most likely function. So they exhibit wear on their pattern, which is on the medial and caudal side, so basically the front and back. And it shows that these guys potentially would have used these tusks to remove branches that had gotten in the way of feeding, and using the proboscis to transport leaf material into its mouth. And from there, Deinotherium would have had a powerful tongue and used to further manipulate food. And different tusk anatomy in young individuals would have suggested altered feeding strategies in juveniles. So yeah, quite cool, interesting. See, we love Deinotherium. Nice to see some mammals. I love seeing some mammals. So yeah, now we've got our last animal. So this one's quite cool. I'm really excited to show off this one. So this is done by Shasurba, who's quite famous for doing a lot of weird, wacky mods, and it's been a while since we got a good mod from him. We've got here Australopithecus. We'll pick one that's kind of walking around in a good mood. We'll have a look at you. Okay. They're quite funny looking in terms of how they walk around. Well, look at you. You look nice. So this is Australopithecus. So Australopithecus, which means southern ape in Latin, is a genus of early hominin, so closely related to us, that existed in Africa during the Pliocene and early Pleistocene. And the genus Homo potentially evolved from an Australopithecus species. And the member of the subtribe Australopithecinae, which includes Ardipithecus. And there's quite a few species described. There's a grahi, a africanus, Sebdoa, Afarensis, Anamintius, Bellarincii, and Neramenta, with debate depicting whether they should be all in Australopithecus or a new genera, or as Panthropus or Kenyathropus or things like that. It's like one of those, taxonomy being taxonomy, I guess. But some are actually, Afarensis are considered to be more related to humans and their ancestors, though Anaminsis cannot be consolidated in this group. The earliest known member of the genus Anaminensis was found in eastern Africa about 4.2 million years ago, and they're thought to be quite widely described around eastern and southern Africa. So some species, found South Africa, like Afarensis is found around southern Africa, Africanus is found around northern Africa, which is quite cool. So their research history: the first specimens were found in 1924 in Tong, South Africa. And this is kind of where they found the skull of the 3-year-old bipedal primate, the tongue child, and he was named Australopithecus afarensis, and was thought to be an early human ancestor, which is quite cool. And it was, started that debate. In 1950, it was actually suggested that all bipedal apes should be called Homo, but then they were considered, Australopithecus, and debates there. There's one called Littlefoot that was actually named Australopithecus prometheus, but now is Africanus. So there's been some lumping and splitting and all of that. But the emergence of genera such as Homo, Kenyathropus, and Parathropus, the taxonomy of these guys is quite difficult, so they should not be left paraphyletic, but they tend to be anyway, so there needs to be a lot of looking into that. Some people have suggested we need to name Homo sapiens into Australopithecus sapiens, or even Pansapiens, so we're in the same genus as modern chimps and bonobos, or move some other species into new genera from Australopithecus. So it's very interesting taxonomy. We're going to have to sort this out somehow. Someone needs to actually get on it, because that's very important. And I think it's funny because we know Homo sapiens with the wise man. We're not actually that wise sometimes, I think. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to change something as fundamental as what we call ourselves. That'd be quite interesting because of taxonomy. But Anamintiensis may have actually just directly kind of evolved from Ardipithecus ramidus, and show that these guys may have been similarities to both Ramidus and Sahelanthropus. So Australopiths have several traits shared with modern humans, but also apes as well. They would have lived throughout eastern and northern Africa. We do know they were walking around on 2 feet because we have preserved footways, trackways. And according to the Chimpanzee Genome Project, the human chimpanzee common ancestor, was about 5 to 6 million years ago. However, there's some that suggest they may be a little bit older, and Orion kind of suggests to be at least 6 million years, so it could be a little bit older, somewhere in that kind of range. But yeah, these are kind of the ones that go before you get into humans. So their anatomy is, most species, they had a brain size that was about 35% the size of modern human brains, with an endocranial volume of about 466 cc, so about around more than average of a chimpanzee. So they were more comparable to chimps, potentially, in intelligence and behavior, which is still, very, very smart. But most species of Australopith were quite small and gracile, usually standing between 1.2 to 1.4 meters, or about 3 foot 11 to 4 foot 7. And it's possible they had quite a considerable degree of sexual dimorphism, with males being larger than female. And in modern populations, males are often considered to be a mere 50% larger than females, while Australopiths could be up to about 50% larger. However, this degree of sexual dimorphism is debated due to the fragmentary nature of these remains. And other papers find that other species may have had sexual dimorphism similar to modern humans. some actually suggested that these guys are more similar to bonobos, and they may be more phenotypically similar to Australopithecus, which is quite interesting. And the fossil records seem to indicate that Australopith were ancestral to Homo and modern humans, and it was once assumed that large brain size was a precursor to bipedalism, but the discovery of Australopithecus with a small brain but developed bipedally under this theory, and nonetheless it was a matter of controversy that how bipedal first emerged, and the advantages of bipedalism were then left to be able to grab objects, look over tall grass, things like that. So yeah, quite cool. And we do have evidence of early fossils such as Orion having kind of that indicating there's a walking stance, working on two legs, and may have originally been an adaptation for walking on trees, but then kind of worked so well to work on the ground, just, and there's some evidence suggests that maybe all apes, like gorillas and things, would have been ancestrally potentially bipedal, and there's a lot of hypotheses and things. People, when it comes to humans, people like to come up with all sorts of cool things and random things. But yeah, in terms of its diet, they weren't very much the hunting gatherers that we think of as modern humans. They were likely a little bit more like chimps in their diet, eating a lot more fruit, vegetables, and tubers, but potentially eating small lizards and small animals. And much research has compared the dental microwear between species. And Afarensis potentially would have eaten like a little bit more. Africanus and Afarensis would have been eating fruits and leaves, while Adamensis would have been feeding on grasses and seeds. So these guys would have been feeding a lot more on that. But then again, a lot of chimps today will hunt, monkeys, so they could have done something like that. So there is evidence. And there's also the robust Australopiths or Panthropus that were large and more big. So Panthropus bosei would have potentially eating more, fibrous, tough plants, more well adapted for, those kind of foods. And all this would have been niche petitioning, be able to avoid kind of things like that. In terms of its technology, it's actually debated if they would have been made stone tools. One species has been associated with mammal bones bearing evidence of tools, and as I mentioned, modern chimps can use tools, so it's not outside the possibility that these guys could definitely have tools. The earliest kind of tool, we have one from 3.3 MYA that's potentially attributed to Deinotherium, which essentially could be a species of Australopithecus, and there's another one from about 3.4 million years ago from cut marks on a bovid leg that could potentially be from butchery from Australopithecus afarensis, but it came from a sandstone, and because it could have been wear on the bone, it's not like 100% confirmed. But we do have a lot of really interesting specimens. Lucy, which is afarensis, she's a complete female, 40% complete female afarensis. The tongue child is Africanus. So there's quite a few interesting and important, fossils. We do have a pretty good fossil record of these guys. And yeah, they tell us a lot about how we became human. So yeah, really, really cool. How can you not love these guys? So that's Australopithecus there. Jasherba did a really awesome job letting them stand up and walk around. Really, really awesome. They can also, they have their own custom drink animation. So I think we'll skip forward and see that because that'll be quite fun. I want to see how that goes. We'll have to get there first. We might just let them run around. They're going to do their social animations. We won't worry about that. Alright. Okay. So yeah, I think this is a great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified of anything. So yeah, but guys, enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.